Hello and welcome to Shaking and Sipping. This is the show where we shake or stir a cocktail or other mixed drinks, give it a sip, talk a bit about how it is, its history, etc. We're continuing to work through the IBA's official list of cocktails to see how those stack up. We're in the unforgettable section, and this week's unforgettable is the Manhattan. Now, this is a very important drink to me, which we'll talk about in a little while, but first, let's talk a little bit about the history of the Manhattan. Now, this is one where we don't know exactly where it came from. We know a lot of stories about it, some of them definitely untrue, some of them just unconfirmable, but we're not entirely sure. Now, where the drink came from a tradition standpoint, we're also not quite sure, but one of two things happened. In the mid-19th century, as we've discussed before, punches had fallen out of favor, instead being replaced by long punches, which then devolved into things like Collinses, as well as fizzes became a thing, and cocktails became a thing, and these were simple drinks. We haven't talked about an old-fashioned, for example, yet, but we will get there. We're talking a spirit, some bitters, maybe some kind of sweetener, maybe a twist of some sort of fruit, maybe. That's it, right? At the same time, there was also the introduction of vermouth. Vermouth actually came over to the US a little bit earlier, but it was becoming popular in the 50s and 60s. So something called the vermouth cocktail showed up. This was basically vermouth in a glass with maybe some bitters, maybe a twist, not much, right? A vermouth and ice. And so you had these two sort of opposite ends of the cocktail spectrum. You had a whiskey cocktail, which is basically pure spirit, and you had a vermouth cocktail, which is incredibly mild. And so at some point, someone decided to either make their whiskey cocktail a bit more drinkable, make it a little bit of a lower proof drink to get through some more of them perhaps, or someone took a vermouth cocktail and said, let's amp that up a bit. Either way, they started to blend them. And this is one of the earliest times when we start seeing cocktails that blend a substantial amount of a hard spirit with something much softer like a vermouth. We see at this same time people adding, dashes of absinthe or dashes of maraschino and other things like that. But the idea of these large proportions of two totally separate things in the spirit family, pretty new here. So, in this time period, and this is anywhere between about 1870, 72, and 1880, someone in New York, most likely, came up with this drink. Now, the old story is that it was a party that Winston Churchill's mother threw for the election of the new New York governor, senator, someone, and that she invented the drink, or her bartender at the party invented the drink. It's a fun story. It's not true. She was in England at the time having Winston Churchill, so that did not happen. Now, historically also, it's ascribed to the Manhattan Club, and maybe it is. We know that the Manhattan Club had a signature cocktail in the 70s that we know nothing about, and we know that the Manhattan Club today says that they invented it, but that's their entire history statement is we invented it. So, maybe. There's also a story that this one guy, his name was Black, that he invented it at this bar in the 60s in New York. The problem is that bar didn't exist in the 60s, and it's not where the author who talks about it says it was. It is on the same street, but it's not where he said it was on that street. Though the interesting thing there is that bar was called the Manhattan Inn. So could it be from there? Maybe. Anyway, we don't know, but it showed up in New York in that time period, in that sort of proportions, and it's a great drink. Now, what is the Manhattan? It is going to be whiskey, vermouth, some bitters, and yep, that's about it. So simple drink. We'll talk about a few different variants of it today, though we're not going to go deep on these. There are lots of different ways to make a Manhattan. We're going to do 3 variants, but they're all going to be fairly traditional, but there's a reason for that. So I mentioned earlier, this drink's very important to me, and that's because this is basically the first cocktail I ever had. And so I had, of course, tried some mixed drinks. I knew I liked a gin and tonic. I knew I liked a whiskey and Coke. But I really hadn't tried any proper cocktails, unless you call whatever some crazy shot someone made for me in college was. But I just decided, I thought cocktails were a thing that I should get into. And they seemed cool, and it was something I was gonna learn about. And I thought, you know what? Manhattan, I've heard of that, it's old, and you know what? It's fancy. Fancy, right? So, how are we gonna make this exciting cocktail when we don't know what we're doing anything about cocktails yet? Well, first we're gonna need a shaker, because cocktails are all shaken, right? So we got this thing, this 3-piece cobbler shaker that I guess is a 4-piece, because it's got this thing that doesn't stay on, but is a thing that we have, so that's good. We're gonna, of course, go to our fine whiskey shelf, and we're gonna pull out the whole number 7, because that's what you need. And then we're gonna go to, I don't know, Target and get the only vermouth they sell. So we're gonna get some Martini and Rossi Rosso, heck yeah. And then we are gonna make a correct decision in our lives, and we're gonna get some Angostura bitters. And that's what we're gonna do. And so let's mix up a decade ago plus Manhattan. First, we're gonna start by putting ice in here because it's a 3-part cobbler shaker. So that's how you do that. So I'm gonna grab some ice. So first we're gonna put not enough ice into our cobbler. And then we are gonna go ahead and begin mixing this. And we are gonna start off with 1.5 ounces, about 45 milliliters of Old Number 7 Jack Daniel's Tennessee Sour Mash Whiskey. And then we're gonna go to our Martini and Rossi Rosso Vermouth. We're gonna add the same amount of that. That's 1.5 ounces, about 45 milliliters. We're gonna add 1 tepid shake of Angostura bitters, because what the heck are these? And then we are gonna do some shaking. Shake it until the tin is cold, because that's what we read on the online thing. Then we get one of these cocktail glasses that's way too big and has these straight sides, which is good. And we're gonna strain that. Strain so smooth out of a cobbler shaker. We have this nice terrible wash line on the glass, which we love to see. And then we need, of course, a maraschino cherry. Now, I actually wasn't able to source the quality of maraschino cherry that I would have used at that time. My local grocers, both of them, only have at least sort of real maraschino cherries, but these at least are not what I normally use. The either Luxardo, or we have a local Seattle brand called Oracella, who makes the proper maraschinos. But this is as close as I could get without making a special trip just to get garbage cherries. And that is a decade ago My Spec Manhattan, and the first cocktail I ever made. It is not very good. So what I'm amazed by is that I continued on the cocktail hobby after this. It's not terrible. It doesn't taste bad now. At the time, it actually tasted a little bit bad. Now it just tastes of nothing. So the Jack Daniels doesn't come through at all, obviously. And nothing against Jack. I was making fun of it a little bit earlier, but it tastes perfectly fine. It's not offensive in any way. It's sweet. You can sip it. It's not a nasty whiskey or anything, but in here it's completely lost. It's just sweet, and there's a little bit of alcohol somewhere. And that's about it. Martini and Rossi Rosso is not my favorite vermouth in the world. It's very heavy and doesn't. You know what? I haven't actually tasted it on its own in years, so let's do that. And then hopefully this will be in service of picking out how exactly it features in the drink. I spilled some and I don't have my apron, so I don't have my bar rag. Yeah, it's very sweet. Raisins. Sweet raisins. but not necessarily a good way. Like, it almost tastes oxidized already, even though that bottle I just opened for this. It doesn't taste offensive either. I'm not opposed to drinking it, but it doesn't taste of much. It's kind of muddy, raisins, oxidation, mixed with kind of sweet with a bit of alcohol, mixed with not enough Angostura to be able to save it. Super diluted and cloudy from making it in the shaker. I mean, it's just not very good. Yeah. It's weird. Somehow, I drank this, and I did think at the time it's not very good, but I also thought it was interesting and decided to pursue. Alright, so moving on to ways to make this drink that aren't crazy and that are much better, let's talk a little bit about the IBA Spec. So the IBA Spec calls for rye whiskey and sweet vermouth, with the rye having a larger proportion than the vermouth, the Angostura, and for it to be stirred. Now, for the first time on the show, I'm going to slightly break the rules, and I'm going to actually not follow the IBA for the IBA version of the drink, but I want to make a point. While rye is traditional and is my favorite thing to have in the drink, proof is more important than whiskey type, and assertiveness is more important. So whilst the Jack Daniel's was a very poor choice for this, you could use perhaps like a bonded Tennessee whiskey. I haven't tried it with that, but that certainly may work. And you can certainly use an assertive bourbon, something that you want at least 100 proof, you want some actual flavor to it. That will work out lovely in this drink. So because the final version is my favorite Manhattan, and I don't need to make all the variants, and I don't need a fourth Manhattan today, I'm going to sub in the Knob Creek here in the IBA variant. But other than that, and with enough talking, let's make the IBA Spec. Alright, so we'll throw some ice in here. And then we are going to start with the Angostura bitters. IBA also only calls for 1 dash. You definitely want that to be a healthy dash though, or a bit more. Then, of what they call for again is rye, but I would say if it's 100 proof plus and assertive, then you can go rye or bourbon, whichever strikes your fancy. And we are going to want 50 milliliters. That is 1 2/3 ounces. And then for vermouth, we again want a sweet vermouth. I'm using Donon Rouge, which is one of my favorites. And of this, we just want 20 milliliters, so about 2/3 of an ounce. And that is again all we need. Let's give it a little stir. And then we're going to want to strain this into either a coupe or a Nick and Nora, small cocktail glass, something like that. And then we're going to add a maraschino cherry, which is what the IBA calls for. You can also do the zest of a lemon. David Wondrich actually prefers that in his. I think that's fine if you like that. I like the maraschino, and I don't mind getting a little bit of juice in there either, as long as it is a good quality, either Luxardo, that's your national brand, or these Oracellas from here in Seattle. And that is pretty close to an IBA spec of the Manhattan. Let's see how that is. So right away, I mean, you still get all the whiskey backbone. It's like you're drinking whiskey. There's some barrel, there's a little bit of hair on it. There's a little bit of that kind of nutty note going on. It's not unsweet, but it's not sweet either. The vermouth then is sort of floating around the whiskey. We're getting a little bit of the wininess. We're getting a little bit of sweetness. We're getting a little bit of sort of botanical notes from it. The Angostura bitters are just, down the line doing their Angostura bitter thing. And it's just a really cool evolving drink that starts off, it hits your tongue, it's almost bitter, and then it opens up and it just gets to this warm whiskey place as it passes. And then there's this lingering sweetness. Maybe you get a hair of the cherry. Right at the end, you're just left with this nice, bright, sweet place after this sort of dark, heavy middle place. It's a great drink. I love the Manhattan, as long as it's not that one I made earlier. So for a final version, we're gonna do a twist on the perfect Manhattan. Now, perfect in the sense of drinks containing vermouth generally means that you're going to use half a Rosso vermouth or sweet vermouth, Italian vermouth, and you're going to use half dry vermouth, white vermouth, French vermouth, etc. I don't like dry vermouth in the context of whiskey. I don't think it works. It's weird, it's bitter, vegetal. I don't like it. However, there is another vermouth that is also white, and in fact is called white, except in French, Blanc vermouth. So Blanc vermouth is totally different. It is a sweet vermouth, but a different sweet vermouth. It's got a little bit of almost a honey-like character to it, in that way that sometimes sugars are kind of complex and taste layered, and a little bit of a sort of floral, but in a sweet sort of sense. It's a great product. I love Dolin Blanc, and this is in fact the whole category of vermouths from this region in France, where Dolin's been making them for hundreds of years, was started by their creation of this, as opposed to the classic dry French vermouth. So anyway, we're gonna do a perfect Manhattan, but using Blanc vermouth as opposed to white dry vermouth. And so for this, we are going to start with Rittenhouse Bottled and Bond rye, the best rye for the money, and one of the best ryes for any money. And of this, we are going to slightly increase our vermouth proportion, but not too much. We'll start out with the same as what the IBA had for the whiskey, and that's going to be the 50 milliliters, or 1 2/3 ounces. Kind of forgot needing the syrup, but we want some of that as well. Also a note, orange bitters work well in this drink. The Manhattan Club, that's what they used in at least later years. I don't know if that's what they officially originally used, but orange bitters have a long history in this drink as well. And then I'm gonna want an ounce total of vermouth. So I'm gonna get half an ounce of the Dolin Blanc. And half an ounce of the Dolin Rouge. And we're going to go ahead and stir that. And just to be traditional on this one, I will strain this into a coupe, even though this is kind of a big coupe, so the wash line is going to be a little lower than I would like for this drink, but I feel like we should honor coupe tradition at some point in the episode. Then again, we're just going to garnish that with a quality cherry. Just a little bit of juice in there. And I didn't talk about it on the last one, but even though this is a dark drink with the whiskey, it is so much nicer to look through than that shaken one. And that is a perfect, in my opinion, Manhattan right there. So the Blanc vermouth comes in right at the beginning. So that initial note, which was almost slightly bitter on the IBA version, there's a brightness right at the beginning. And then the rye comes in, still very assertive rye, nice bit of spice in the back of your throat about halfway through the drink. Yeah, the Rouge vermouth is working out in the middle, a little bit of darkness, a little bit of wine notes, but that Blanc vermouth keeps everything up high the whole time, the rye keeps everything down low the whole time. It's just a fun drink, a little spicy, little sweet, little alcohol-y. I would highly recommend that to anyone watching. Well, thank you for coming along with me this week as we looked at the Manhattan, its history, and my odd entry into cocktaildom. Hope you enjoyed it. If so, please do all the YouTube things, like, share, subscribe, whatnot. Also check the blog, shakingandsipping.com, where we'll have a write-up on this drink, just as we do each and every drink. Also check back on the blog tomorrow, where you'll have a write-up of what happens when we go and order this at a local Seattle cocktail bar, see if they make any tweaks, see if it's something they make a lot, etc. Also follow on Twitter at shaking_sipping for any updates that need to go out over Twitter and that sort of thing. We'll see you back on the blog tomorrow for the IBA in Real Life write-up, and we'll see you back next week for the next episode of this here program, Shaking and Sipping. Until next week, happy sipping. Cheers.